At 9:02 on the morning of February 19th, 1945, the ramps dropped onto the black sand of Iwo Jima. Marines stepped forward into thigh-deep water, rifles held high, packs dragging at their shoulders. The sand swallowed their boots with every step. Each man carried 60, sometimes 80 pounds of gear. Ammunition, grenades, gas masks, entrenching tools, everything they would need to survive the next few hours. And still, nothing happened. No machine gun fire, no mortars, no artillery. The naval bombardment had ended only minutes earlier. For 3 days, the island had been pounded from the sea. For weeks before that, carrier aircraft had struck it again and again. Intelligence officers had promised the defenses would be shattered. But as the Marines advanced inland, there was only silence. That silence felt wrong. Veterans later said it was worse than incoming fire. Fire made sense. Fire could be answered. This emptiness could not. Then, among the first wave, one Marine stepped onto the beach carrying a weapon no one had been issued. It was lighter than the standard machine guns. Cruder. Welded together from mismatched parts. An aircraft gun bolted to a rifle stock. 100-round ammunition box hanging from its side. It did not exist on any supply list. It was not authorized. And in the next few minutes, it would start saving lives. Because the silence on Iwo Jima was not peace. It was a trap. The silence had been planned. Buried deep beneath the island, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi listened and waited. He had studied every American landing since Guadalcanal. He knew how naval bombardment worked. He knew how Marines expected the enemy to fight. So he ordered his men to do the opposite. Do not defend the beaches. Do not reveal your positions. Let them land. Beneath Iwo Jima, more than 11 miles of tunnels connected bunkers, artillery pits, command posts, and machine gun nests, concrete walls 6 feet thick, firing ports barely wide enough for a barrel, positions layered so that every approach was covered from multiple angles. Kuribayashi had forbidden the kind of suicidal charges that had wasted Japanese lives on earlier islands. There would be no last stands at the waterline. His men would stay hidden, protected, invisible. As the beaches filled with Marines, Japanese gunners waited with weapons already sighted in. They had measured the distances. They had marked the killing zones. Every terrace of sand, every piece of broken ground had been calculated in advance. At 9:15, Kuribayashi gave the order. The island erupted. Machine guns opened from places the Marines couldn't see. Mortars dropped with brutal precision. Artillery shells walked through the landing zones. Rockets screamed in from hidden launchers. Men went down where they stood. Others were hit as they tried to help them. Landing craft burned. Amphibious tractors exploded. The black sand churned under fire, offering almost no cover at all. The Marines had trained for this. They expected heavy resistance. What they had not expected was a defense designed not to stop them at the beach, but to let them come ashore, crowd together, and then destroy them all at once. To survive, the Marines would have to move forward, and to move forward they would have to silence guns that could not be seen, positions that could not be flanked, and bunkers that could not be cracked from a distance. What they needed was time, seconds of it. And on Iwo Jima, seconds were the rarest thing on the island. On Iwo Jima, killing the enemy was not the problem, finding him was. Japanese bunkers were carved into volcanic rock, reinforced with concrete, and masked so carefully that Marines could walk past them without seeing a firing port. A gun would open, fire for seconds, then disappear back into the island. By the time return fire arrived, the position was already silent again. Even when Marines knew where a Paisa bunker was, destroying it meant getting close, very close. Satchel charges had to be placed by hand. Flamethrowers were only effective inside 20 meters. Inside that distance, a single machine gun could cut down an entire squad. To reach those distances, the enemy had to be forced to keep his head down. That was where the problem began. The Browning automatic rifle gave squads mobility, 20 rounds at a time, fired fast, then empty. Good for movement, not enough to pin a fortified position. The M19 Online A6 machine gun offered sustained fire, but it came at a cost. Heavy, awkward, slow to maneuver in soft sand and broken ground. By the time it was set up, the fight had often already shifted. Both weapons were effective on paper. Neither solved the problem Marines were facing on the beach. Concrete absorbed rifle fire. Narrow firing ports swallowed bullets without effect. Suppressive fire that lasted only a second or two wasn't enough. When the shooting stopped, even briefly, Japanese gunners popped back up and fired again. The assault stalled. Men were pinned down behind shell craters and wrecked vehicles, unable to move forward and unable to pull back. What the Marines needed was something they did not have: a weapon light enough to move with the assault, powerful enough to overwhelm a firing port instantly, and fast enough to buy just a few precious seconds, long enough for someone to run forward with explosives. That combination did not exist in the Marine Corps inventory. But the problem itself was not new. It had already been discovered months earlier on a very different island by Marines who had learned the hard way that doctrine could not always keep you alive. 16 months before Iwo Jima, the problem had revealed itself somewhere else. Bougainville. The island was the opposite of Iwo Jima in almost every way. No open beaches, no volcanic sand, just dense jungle, steep ridges, swamps, and rain that never seemed to stop. Visibility, measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Japanese defenders used the terrain perfectly. Ambushes from concealed positions, machine guns hidden behind logs and earth, bunkers so well camouflaged that Marines often discovered them only when they opened fire. The result was always the same. A sudden burst of gunfire, Marines diving for cover, movement freezing in place, every attempt to advance answered instantly by bullets from a position that could not be clearly seen. The 3rd Marine Parachute Battalion fought there, elite troops trained to operate independently, aggressively, and without much support. They were good Marines, well-led, well-trained, and even they were being stopped cold. During the early fighting, Marines began noticing something scattered along the beachhead after the landings. Aircraft wreckage, broken wings, twisted fuselages, and among them, intact machine guns torn from downed Navy planes, lightweight, air-cooled, built to fire at extreme rates. One Marine looked at those guns and saw something different. Not scrap, but a solution. What followed was not an official experiment. There were no drawings, no approvals, no tests beyond combat itself. Just a decision made under fire, because the weapons they had were not enough, and the next ambush would not wait for permission. The Marines fighting on Bougainville belonged to a unit that no longer exists. They were called the Paramarines, volunteers who trained to jump into combat, operate independently, and fight cut off from support. The Marine Corps had created them to test a new kind of warfare. What it got instead was infantrymen who were unusually aggressive, adaptable, and comfortable improvising under pressure. By November of 1943, those traits were being tested in the jungle. Bougainville was a nightmare to fight through. Thick vegetation swallowed sound and movement. Japanese positions were invisible until they fired. Patrols walked into ambushes at point-blank range, then froze as machine gun fire pinned them in place. The Paramarines learned quickly that when a Japanese gun opened up, you had seconds to react. If the gun kept firing, you were stuck. If it went quiet, even briefly, you could move. During the early days of the landing, Marines noticed aircraft wreckage scattered along the beaches, Navy planes that had crashed or been shot down. Still bolted to some of them were AN-M2 .30 caliber machine guns, aircraft weapons designed to fire at extreme rates for aerial combat. One Marine, Private William Colby, decided to try something. He bolted a bipod onto one of the aircraft guns. It was crude, ungainly, still fitted with spade grips meant for mounting inside a plane. But it worked. 2 days later, when his squad was ambushed on patrol, Colby deployed the modified gun. An assistant fed the belt. Colby pulled the trigger. The weapon roared. At over 1,000 rounds per minute, the sound was continuous, more like tearing fabric than individual shots. Japanese soldiers who had been advancing aggressively went flat. They stopped firing. They took cover. For a few seconds, the jungle went quiet. That was all the time the squad needed. They maneuvered, they broke contact, they lived. The experiment had proven something important. You didn't need perfect accuracy. You didn't even need sustained fire. You needed overwhelming fire right now. Someone else was watching closely. and he understood that this crude modification was not the end of the idea. It was the beginning. The Marine who paid the closest attention to Colby's experiment was a sergeant named Milan Grevich. Grevich was not an inventor in the traditional sense. He wasn't trying to design something new. He was trying to fix something that was getting Marines killed. He had watched squads freeze under fire, watched assaults stall because no one could move without being cut down. When he saw what the aircraft gun had done, how quickly it forced the enemy to take cover, he understood the implication immediately. The idea wasn't the bipod, it wasn't the salvaged gun, it was the rate of fire. If that kind of suppression could be controlled, if it could be aimed, if it could be carried forward with the assault instead of dragged behind it, then everything changed. Grevich brought the problem to his platoon leader, Lieutenant Philip Gray. Gray was one of those officers who understood weapons not as doctrine, but as tools. He didn't dismiss the idea. He helped refine it. Together, they started modifying the aircraft gun properly. The spade grips were removed and replaced with a rifle stock taken from an M1 Garand, reshaped by hand to fit the receiver. A bar bipod was mounted to stabilize the weapon when firing prone. A rear sight was added so it could actually be aimed. The hardest problem was the trigger. Aircraft guns fired electrically. A solenoid activated the weapon when a button was pressed, perfect for a rigid mount inside a plane, useless for a shoulder-fired gun. Grevich and Gray built a mechanical trigger that closed an electrical circuit when pulled. Simple, direct, reliable. When they finished, the weapon could be carried and fired like a rifle, but it delivered firepower no rifle squad had ever had before. Over 1,000 rounds per minute, the Marines who tested it gave it a name that had nothing to do with engineering. They called it the Stinger. Because that kind of fire didn't just kill, it hurt. One Marine carrying a Stinger could put more rounds downrange than several men with standard weapons. It wasn't meant to win firefights by itself. It was meant to do something more important. It was meant to make the enemy stop shooting. The prototype was completed late in the Bougainville campaign. By then, the fighting was winding down. The Stinger never got its real test there. But the problem it was built to solve wasn't going away. It was getting worse, and the next island would demand more from the Marines than anything they had faced before. By early 1944, the Para-Marines were finished. The Marine Corps had decided that parachute operations made little sense in the Pacific. The battalions were disbanded. Their men were reassigned to standard infantry units. The experiment was over. But the problem Grevich had identified went with him. He was sent to the newly formed 5th Marine Division, a unit being built almost from scratch for future operations. Training began in California, then intensified in Hawaii. Live fire exercises, amphibious assaults, rehearsals for an invasion everyone knew was coming, even if no one yet knew where. Grevich trained with the M19 Il-19A6 machine gun issued to his new unit, and his frustration grew. It was heavy, slow to reposition, hard to bring forward in an assault. Everything the Stinger had been designed to fix was still there. So in November of 1944 at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, Grevich decided to act. He approached his company commander with a proposal. Not a demand, not a formal request, just an explanation. He described the aircraft gun he had modified on Bougainville. He explained the rate of fire, the weight, what it could do in the first seconds of contact. The commander listened. Officially, there was no way to authorize such a weapon. There were regulations, supply chains, property books, serial numbers. Unofficially, his Marines were about to assault a heavily fortified island. The approval Grevich received was quiet, conditional, deliberately vague. Don't ask where the parts come from. Don't make it a problem for anyone else. Just make it work. Aircraft graveyards on Hawaii were full of damaged planes being stripped for parts. Mechanics had access. Parts disappeared. No one asked too many questions. In the middle of a war, some questions were safer unanswered. Grevich's assistant was a private first class named John Little. Years later, when asked where the parts came from, Little would simply say he didn't remember. Together, they went to work. Each Stinger was built by hand. Aircraft guns were stripped down, rifle stocks were fitted and reinforced, bipods mounted, sights aligned carefully. Trigger assemblies wired and tested again and again, ammunition boxes fabricated to hold a 100-round belt without jamming. When they were finished, 6 weapons lay on the bench. They weighed just over 20 pounds without ammunition, far lighter than the standard machine gun, and they fired 3 times faster. There was no paperwork, no authorization forms, no record they existed at all. 5 Stingers were assigned quietly within G Company of the 28th Marines. The 6th would go to a Marine from a different unit, a man whose skills made him uniquely suited to carry a weapon built by hand because he understood exactly how it worked. His name was Tony Stein. Tony Stein was not an inventor. He was a tool maker. Before the war, Stein worked at a General Motors plant in Dayton, Ohio, shaping metal to precise tolerances, learning how stress traveled through steel, how parts failed, and how to make them hold. It was quiet work, exacting work, the kind that punished mistakes. When the war came, those skills followed him into the Marine Corps. Stein enlisted in 1942 and volunteered for the Para-Marines. He fought in the Solomon Islands, then on Bougainville, where his reputation grew quickly. He was aggressive, controlled, and relentless. He hunted Japanese snipers. He moved toward danger instead of away from it. Other Marines noticed. So did Grevich. The Stinger was not a weapon for someone who fired and repositioned cautiously. It burned ammunition at an extraordinary rate. It demanded confidence, discipline, and an understanding of how metal behaved when pushed to its limits. Stein had all of that. He understood how the weapon had been built because he had helped build it. He knew how the trigger worked, how the stock absorbed recoil, how the feed system could fail if mishandled. He trusted the Stinger because he understood it, not as an issued weapon, but as a machine. When the 5th Marine Division boarded transports for its next operation, 35,000 Marines prepared to go ashore. Only 6 carried Stingers. Tony Stein was one of them. He did not know where he would land. He did not know what waited beyond the beach, but he knew this. When the shooting started, someone would have to stand up, draw fire, and give the others time to move. And when that moment came, Stein would not hesitate. At 9:15, the waiting ended. Every Japanese gun on Iwo Jima opened fire at once. Machine guns erupted from hidden positions along the terraces. Mortars slammed into the sand with brutal accuracy. Artillery shells walked through the landing zones, tearing apart men and equipment alike. Rockets screamed in from launchers buried deep inside the island. The beach became a killing ground. Marines dropped where they stood. Others were hit as they tried to drag the wounded out of the surf. Amphibious tractors burned. Landing craft took direct hits and sank at the waterline. The black sand, soft and loose, offered almost no protection. Men clawed at it anyway, pressing themselves into shell holes, behind wrecked vehicles, behind anything that might stop a bullet. Company A of the 28th Marines was ordered inland toward Mount Suribachi. The mountain dominated the southern end of the island, a volcanic cone rising more than 500 feet above the beach. Japanese observers on its slopes could see everything, every movement, every concentration of men, every attempt to advance. The ground between the beach and the mountain was open and exposed, covered by interlocking fields of fire from bunkers no one could clearly see. Every step forward drew bullets. Every pause invited mortars. The advance slowed to meters. Squads were pinned in place, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, trapped between the surf and the guns ahead of them. The battle was unfolding exactly as Kuribayashi had intended. If the Marines were going to survive, someone would have to break the pattern. Someone would have to move while the enemy was still shooting. And that meant doing something no one had been trained to do on one of the most heavily defended beaches in the Pacific War. Tony Stein did something no one had ordered him to do. He stood up. In the middle of the beach, under direct observation from Mount Suribachi, Stein rose from cover and stepped forward into the open. He did not run. He did not crouch. He walked upright, fully exposed, carrying the Stinger at his shoulder. It violated every rule Marines were taught to live by. You stayed low. You used cover. You never drew fire deliberately. Stein ignored all of it. Japanese. Gunners saw him immediately. A Marine standing alone was an easy target. Muzzle flashes bloomed from hidden positions as they opened fire on him. That was exactly what Stein wanted. He watched the flashes, traced them back to firing ports cut into rock and concrete. Then he pulled the trigger. The Stinger came alive in his hands. At 1,500 rounds per minute, the weapon did not chatter. It roared. A solid stream of fire hammered into the bunker apertures, pouring bullets through openings barely wider than a man's fist. The effect was instant. Japanese gunners ducked. Then they disappeared. They stopped shooting, not because they were dead, but because staying exposed meant dying. Those seconds mattered. Behind Stein, Marines moved. Demolition teams ran forward with satchel charges. Flamethrower operators advanced toward the bunkers. Riflemen covered the flanks as explosions tore through concrete and fire rolled into firing ports. Stein shifted targets and did it. Again. Stand up. Draw fire. Find the gun. Suppress it. Position after position fell the same way. The Stinger was not accurate in the traditional sense. It didn't need to be. It filled space with violence. It denied the enemy the ability to fight back, long enough for Marines to close the distance and finish the job. On that beach, doctrine failed. An unauthorized weapon, carried by a Marine willing to break every rule, succeeded. And Stein was just getting started. The Stinger solved one problem. It created another. At full cyclic rate, a 100-round belt lasted only a few seconds, 4 seconds of fire, sometimes less. The weapon could dominate a bunker instantly, but only if it was fed constantly. Tony Stein burned through ammunition faster than any Marine on the beach. He had a choice. Conserve fire and let Japanese gunners recover, or keep shooting and find a way to stay supplied. Stein chose to keep shooting. When his ammunition ran dry, he turned and ran back, toward the waterline. 600 meters across open ground, no cover, no concealment, mortars falling, artillery walking the beach, Japanese observers on Suribachi watching everything. He reached the landing zone, grabbed ammunition boxes, and ran back into the fight. Then he did it again. And again. 8 times that day, Stein crossed that stretch of beach under fire. Each trip meant more ammunition for the Stinger, and each trip meant passing wounded Marines struggling toward the rear. If a man could walk, Stein helped him. If he couldn't, Stein carried him. Only then did he pick up more ammunition and turn back toward the guns. Each ammunition box weighed nearly 20 pounds. Stein carried several at a time, along with the Stinger and his own gear, running through soft volcanic sand that pulled at his feet with every step. Twice, Japanese bullets struck the Stinger itself, knocking it from his hands. Each time, Stein picked it up, checked it, and kept going. The weapon still worked. As the hours wore on, Stein made another decision. He took off his helmet, then his boots. The helmet cut his hearing. The boots slowed him down in the sand. Speed mattered more than protection. He ran barefoot, carrying ammunition and wounded men while shells burst around him. By the end of the day, Stein had personally killed at least 20 enemy soldiers. The number mattered less than the result. His fire gave his platoon room to move. It gave demolition teams time to work. It gave Marines a way forward when there should have been none. On a beach designed to kill everyone who stepped onto it, Tony Stein refused to stay pinned down. He kept moving, and because he did, others survived to move with him. The fighting for Mount Suribachi continued for days. Tony Stein was there for the push inland, providing covering fire as Marines clawed their way toward the mountain's base. Somewhere along the slopes, he was wounded. The injuries were serious enough that he was finally pulled from the line and evacuated offshore to a hospital ship. For most Marines, that would have been the end. Stein's war on Iwo Jima should have been over, but 10 days after the landing, the fighting had moved north, into broken volcanic ground filled with ravines, cliffs, and caves reinforced with concrete and steel. The 28th Marines were locked in brutal combat near a position known as Hill 362. Casualties were mounting, units were being ground down by attrition. Stein heard about it from his hospital bed. He did not wait for orders. He did not ask for permission. He left the hospital ship and went back ashore. His wounds were not fully healed. Medical staff would have kept him off the line for days, possibly weeks. Stein ignored them. His unit was fighting, and that was enough. On the morning of March 1st, 1945, Company A was pinned down by a well-concealed Japanese machine gun position. Every attempt to advance drew fire. Men were being hit. The attack stalled. Stein volunteered to lead a patrol to locate the gun. 19 Marines moved out with him into the shattered ground. Somewhere ahead, a Japanese sniper was already watching, and this time, Tony Stein would not make it back. Tony Stein was killed instantly. A single rifle shot struck him in the head as he moved with the patrol near Hill 362. There was no last stand, no dramatic rescue. One moment he was leading Marines forward, the next, he was gone. He was 23 years old. News of his death would reach his wife weeks later, delivered by telegram. In time, she would receive his personal effects, and eventually, his Medal of Honor. The citation described his courage on D-Day, his 8 trips across the beach, his deliberate exposure to enemy fire, his use of a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon. It did not explain what that weapon was. It did not say who built it. It did not say how it came to exist. And it did not say what happened to it. The Stingers vanished. There were no serial numbers, no property records, no supply forms. Some were likely destroyed in combat. Others may have been damaged beyond repair. A few may have been discarded during cleanup, dumped into the sea along with mountains of wreckage once the island was secured. By the time ordnance officers tried to examine them, most were already gone. Officially, the weapons never existed. Unofficially, their impact was impossible to ignore. Reports circulated quietly. A lightweight belt-fed weapon with extreme rates of fire had proven devastatingly effective in assault conditions. It gave squads the suppression they needed without the weight that slowed them down. One recommendation suggested replacing a bar in each rifle squad with something like the Stinger. Nothing came of it. The war ended too soon. Budgets were cut. Millions of men went home. Development programs were canceled. The Stinger slipped into obscurity, remembered only by the Marines who had seen it work. But the idea did not disappear. Years later, when the Marine Corps adopted new squad automatic weapons, lighter, faster, designed to move with the assault, the lineage was there, even if the name was not. The weapon was gone. The lesson remained. Today, Iwo Jima is quiet. The black sand is still there. The terraces still rise from the beach. Mount Suribachi still dominates the southern end of the island, just as it did in 1945. Rusting steel and crumbling concrete mark the places where men once fought at point-blank range. The gunfire is gone. So are the men. Tony Stein was buried with full military honors. His Medal of Honor is preserved. His name is remembered. But the weapon he carried that day, the one built by hand, never approved, never recorded, no longer exists. It didn't survive the war. Its influence did. The lesson of the Stinger was simple and uncomfortable. Innovation does not come from manuals or committees. It comes from people close enough to the problem to understand it and desperate enough to fix it with whatever they have. On Iwo Jima, rules were broken because lives depended on it. 6 Marines carried weapons that were never supposed to be there. One of them stood up on a beach designed to kill him and gave others the seconds they needed to live. The Stinger is gone. What it represented is not. And if this story was worth remembering, thank you for remembering it.